My name is Caleb. I was out in a dense forest in rural Oregon, far from the city, collecting environmental data. I set up my camp in a spot that was at least a 90-minute hike to the highway. My job was to record wildlife movement, so I had set up several hidden cameras. I started this whole project alone, and that was my biggest mistake. It was September, and the nights were starting to get cold. I'd been in the woods for a week, and everything was routine. One day, around 2 p.m., I headed out to check the data on my cameras. I had placed 8 cameras, and the last one was the furthest from my camp. When I got to that final camera and pulled the memory card, I decided to sit there and watch a couple of the clips. The first clip was a deer, and the second was a wildcat. Then the third clip started. In this clip, there was a human being. It was a woman. According to the camera's timestamp, the clip was from 3 days ago at 11 p.m. She was standing directly in front of the camera, facing it. She was wearing very old, torn clothes, and her hair was messy. She was staring right into the lens. Her eyes weren't scary, but her expressionless, vacant gaze was deeply unsettling. The woman stood there, perfectly still, for about 50 seconds. Then she slowly brought one hand up toward the camera lens and gently moved it away without touching it. Then she walked out of the camera's range in the direction of my camp. A chill ran through my entire body. I checked my watch. It was 3 p.m. I immediately started running back to check the cards from the other cameras. My first thought was that she must be a hiker who got lost. But why would a woman be in this remote part of the woods at 11 p.m.? I got back to my camp and quickly put the remaining camera cards into my laptop. A camera that was closer to my camp also had a clip of the woman. The time was still 11 p.m. In this clip, she was looking at my empty tent. She was slowly circling the tent, like she was looking for something. She didn't look like a thief, more like someone who was completely lost. I checked the final camera. This one was mounted on a tree directly facing the entrance of my tent. In this clip, the woman was much closer. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, or maybe hunger. The timestamp on this clip was 11:15 p.m. She bent down and touched the zipper of my tent, then stood up and looked back at the camera. And what happened next sent a shiver down my spine. She slowly opened her mouth with her hand and made a sound that was completely inhuman. It was a long, deep, and wavering moan like a wounded animal in pain. Then she stopped looking at the camera and fixed her gaze on the tent, right where I would have been sleeping inside at that moment. I slammed the laptop shut and stood up, looking all around. The sun was about to set. This fear wasn't about ghosts. It was the realization that a disturbed, unbalanced woman had been circling me in my sleep in the middle of the wilderness. My heart pounded because I suddenly remembered that when I woke up that morning, the zipper of my tent was slightly open, even though I always closed it securely. I immediately started packing up my tent. I only had a small shovel for self-defense, which I grabbed and held onto. I couldn't stay here for another minute. I grabbed my car keys and started hiking fast before it got dark. I kept looking over my shoulder, and I felt like someone was watching me behind the trees in the forest. Every broken twig made me jump. By the time I reached the highway, it was 8 p.m. I got in my car and drove straight home. I never showed that camera footage to anyone, and I never went back to that spot. Who was that woman? Why was she there? And why did she make that strange sound? I've never answered that question. The scariest part for me was knowing she was that close and I was completely unaware, just sleeping.
If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Also, let me know in the comments how you found the video. Now, let's move on to the next story.
This story isn't mine. It belongs to my friend, Jacob. It happened last summer. Jacob was volunteering as a lookout in a remote area of Montana. This is basically a tall tower in the forest where they watch for wildfires. His tower, called Heckler Point, was a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. There wasn't another person for miles. Jacob had been staying in the tower for about 2 weeks. The days were pretty boring, but the nights were quiet and peaceful. He'd write in his journal, read books, and watch the sunsets. One day, a Friday, Jacob was sitting at the top of the tower drinking coffee. It was around 6 p.m. He saw something on the old logging road below. An old, rusty pickup truck was driving extremely slowly toward the tower. This was really unusual. He'd only had one visit from the Forest Service guy who delivered supplies, and that guy always radioed ahead. There was no notification this time. Jacob took out his binoculars and watched the truck. It stopped maybe 100 yards before the tower, right where the forest started. 2 guys got out of the truck, both men. One was tall and skinny, the other shorter with wide shoulders. Their clothes looked like they'd been out in the woods for days. The 2 men stood absolutely still for a while, staring directly at the tower. Jacob did not like their quiet staring. They didn't look like hikers or campers. Both strangers were holding something in their hands, long, wooden-looking objects. Jacob turned on his radio and tried to call the base station. "Heckler Point, calling base station. Does anyone read me?" All he got was static. The area was so remote, sometimes the signal just died. For about 10 minutes, they just stood down there, looking at the tower. Then, both men slowly turned and walked away from the truck, cutting through the woods to get closer to the tower. Jacob's heart was really starting to pound now. He immediately chained and locked the tower's metal door from the inside, even though he knew it was just a thin sheet of metal. He tried the radio again, shouting this time, but still no answer. It was 7 p.m. The sun was beginning to set. He heard footsteps coming from below, right near the wooden stairs leading up to the tower. Someone started climbing the steps, slowly. 1 step, then another, then a third. They were moving so deliberately slow, it gave Jacob the chills. Jacob sat quietly. He had an old licensed rifle that was part of the fire lookout equipment. He got it ready and pointed it toward the door. The noises kept coming up and then stopped, right beneath the door. A long silence followed. Then there was a hard thump on the wooden door. It sounded like someone was trying to poke through. Then a deep, raspy voice. Someone was speaking from outside. "Hey, is anyone up there? We're lost. We need your help." The voice was plain and normal, but the way they showed up, ditching the truck and coming through the woods, it all felt wrong to Jacob. Jacob yelled back loudly, "There's no help here. This is a government post. You have to leave. Get out of here right now." Silence outside. Then the taller guy spoke, his voice much harsher. "We know you're in there. We saw you on the tower. Just open up. We just need water and a map. We won't bother you." Jacob did not open the door. It was 7:45 p.m. They were there, and they weren't leaving. Then another thump came, but it wasn't on the door. It was on one of the wooden support beams for the tower. Jacob saw the shorter man hit the wooden support beam with the object he was holding. It wasn't a stick. It was a small axe. They were trying to damage the strong wooden structure of the tower. Jacob's fear turned to anger. He felt that if he didn't do anything, they'd sit there all night and maybe even break in. He quickly grabbed a piece of wooden framing from the back of the tower and threw it down hard toward the area right above where they were working on the stairs. There was a shout from below. Then both of them started cursing loudly from below. They didn't want any more confrontation. Jacob thought they would leave. Instead, they sat down on the ground right near the support beam and started building a fire, basically setting up camp right under Jacob's tower. Jacob stood there all night, clutching the rifle, watching the glow of their fire and their quiet, staring eyes from the tower. They stayed there until about 4 a.m. As soon as the sun started to rise, they got up without a word, walked back to their truck, and disappeared into the forest. Jacob decided to leave the next day, immediately. To this day, he doesn't know who they were or what they wanted from him, but he's still sure their intentions were not to ask for directions. My name is Austin. I wasn't out for an adventure. I was in the woods for a very practical reason. My younger brother Tim wanted to buy some land near a border town and asked me to go survey it to get an accurate idea of the boundaries. A large portion of the land fell deep into the Appalachian forest. It was a chilly day in October, and I took my truck out that Friday morning. I found the general area listed in the paperwork. Tim told me that at the far corner of his plot, there was a large rock marker, and right next to it, an old, ancient-looking iron fence started, separating his land from someone else's property. My job was to use the GPS to verify the exact position of that fence line. I parked my truck on an old trail and started walking in. The sunlight barely penetrated the forest. It was about 1 p.m. After hiking for a few hours, I found the large rock that marked the spot. From there, I located the fence line through the brush. It looked centuries old. I started walking along the fence. It was a painstaking process because the fence was broken in places and hidden by thorns. I kept walking for about an hour, and I noticed the fence looked a little sinister. There were strange objects hanging on it in different spots. Things like old, rusty tin cans, small pieces of plastic, and torn scraps of cloth. I figured some idiot camper left these things to mark their trail. I checked my GPS. I was right on track when I stopped at one spot. On the other side of the fence, there was a strange mound on the ground. It wasn't exactly a structure, just a big pile of old, compacted cloth. On top of it, 2 small pieces of wood were laid out in a cross shape. It looked like some kind of small shrine or boundary marker. I tried to ignore it and kept moving. But about 20 feet ahead, right next to the fence, I saw something move in the brush for a second. For a brief instant, I thought I saw a face staring at me. I stopped immediately. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I looked around. Nothing but forest. I figured it must have been my eyes playing tricks on me. I started walking again, and then I saw it again. This time, the movement was very close. Behind the brush, where the fence was broken, a person was standing silently. They were average height and wearing dark green or khaki clothing that almost blended into the forest colors. Their face was hidden in the shadows of the trees, but I knew they were watching me. I pulled out my survey hammer from my pocket as a makeshift weapon. I yelled loudly, "I'm surveying! This is my property! Who are you?" The person didn't move at all. No reaction. Just a complete, lifeless silence. It was almost 4 p.m. The sun was about to disappear and the forest was getting dark. I realized how far I was from anywhere I could be heard. I didn't know what to do. If he was a crazy guy, reacting might be dangerous. If he was a simple hiker, pulling out my hammer was weird. But his silence and sudden appearance were enough to make me want to scream. I decided I would leave the fence line and run back through the woods rather than keep walking along the border and confronting the guy. The moment I turned to run away from the fence, I heard a sound behind me. It wasn't a shout or a curse. It was a metallic tapping sound, like someone hitting the iron fence with a sharp object, once, then twice, then 3 times. I kept running without looking back. I abandoned the GPS and all my survey gear because it was too heavy to run with. That metallic sound kept echoing in my ears, like someone was warning me not to cross their boundary. I reached my truck exhausted sometime near midnight. I started the engine and drove out of there. When I called Tim later, he told me some of the old residents in that area are extremely sensitive about their land borders and don't like strangers. Some people mark their boundaries in strange ways. He said, "You probably disturbed some solitary guy on his private property." But who was that person, and why did he just stand there silently? Was he truly just marking his territory, or was he threatening me? The fear of a lone, totally isolated individual silently watching you in the wilderness, that thought still bothers me the most. This was back in 2015. I just started a new job and desperately needed some mental peace. My name is Aaron, and honestly, I was fed up with city life. So I decided to go to a remote campground in the Adirondack Mountains for the weekend, a place with zero cell service. I thought a couple of days alone in the woods would be perfect. I left New York City around 2 p.m. on Friday and got there by evening. I set up my small tent, built a fire, and cooked dinner. The weather was nice, and seriously, the silence was incredibly peaceful. I lay down inside the tent around 10 p.m. I fell asleep shortly after. Then, around midnight, maybe 1:30 a.m., I woke up to a sound. Something was moving slowly outside the tent. It wasn't the sound of human footsteps. It was more like something heavy being dragged across the ground. I froze, barely breathing. I thought it was an animal, but the movement was right next to my camp, behind my car. I instantly reached for my headlamp, but kept it off. I gently opened the small zipper on the tent door and peered out. My car was parked there, and for a second, I didn't see anything. I blinked my eyes again, and then I saw it. The back door of my car, which I was absolutely sure I had closed, was slightly ajar. I instantly knew this wasn't an animal. It was a person. I felt a weird, cold dread, that kind of fear that tells you you are no longer alone. I pulled my pocket knife out of my clothes and gripped it tightly in my hand. I waited for a long moment, but there was no more movement outside. Maybe the person had left, or they were hiding. I knew I wasn't safe in that tent anymore. I decided I would make a dash for the car and get out of there as fast as possible. Before leaving, I called out loudly, "Hello! Who's out there?" Silence. I slowly crawled out of the tent, keeping my headlamp pointed down so they couldn't see exactly where I was. As soon as I reached the car, I yanked the door open and scrambled inside. I immediately locked the doors and tried to start the engine. The car roared to life. That was a huge relief. I switched on the headlights, and just as I put the car in reverse, two figures came into my light beam. They emerged from the bushes and were staring at my car. Both were wearing old, dirty clothes, and one man had a long wooden stick in his hand. One guy, with long hair and a bushy beard, was glaring at me. I saw intense anger in his eyes, like I had committed a crime by being in their territory. In seconds, I reversed the car and then slammed it into drive, speeding down the rocky road. I didn't dare look back. I had a horrible feeling about what would have happened if I had stayed in that tent a few minutes longer. What would they have done if they found me alone there? Driving down the forest road, I checked my phone to call emergency services. No service. I had to keep driving on that awful road. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw another vehicle coming toward us from far behind. I took a deep breath and drove until I finally reached the main highway, far from the town. I got service around 3 a.m. When I finally reached a safe area and called the police, they said they would do a sweep near the campsite, but since nothing was stolen and there was no physical harm, they couldn't do much. The officer, Doug, told me that sometimes people who are cut off from city life and don't like strangers frequent that area. When I finally checked my gear, I found out that my kitchen knife and my camping axe were missing from the front of the tent. Why did they take those? I'd never felt so vulnerable. Since then, I've permanently given up the idea of solitary camping. What happened that night reminds me that the biggest danger in the woods isn't a wild animal, but a human being who wants to hurt you.